Let's start now talking about arresting the damage.
Well, the first thing that I think it's a lot easier, actually, to get a hold of the climate problem than the land and water use problem.
Why is that?
In some ways, the biodiversity crisis is a more difficult problem than the climate problem. Climate problem has one primary cause: fossil fuel burning. In addition, there's methane from cattle, methane from rice cultivation, and so forth, and deforestation. But we could deal with the major part of that problem by rapidly transitioning from fossil fuels to solar. It won't do any reversal of the damage that we've already done to the biosphere, to biodiversity, but it will prevent hugely greater damage in the future that will occur if we don't do this.
Tom, do you agree with that? You were nodding.
I think, yeah, I agree. I just, in general, talking about two children and you know, if trying to keep fossil fuels in the ground really should be one of our
Keeping
priorities.
two children in the ground?
Oh, no, keeping two children around. Keeping two children. Damn.
I thought you had it there for a minute.
Land use change will be, yeah. I mean, I just keep pumping back. Like, I know that if we were in this room 40 years from now, it actually wouldn't be a bunch of white old men and women. It would be a huge, diverse group of people from all over the world. Here in Los Angeles, like, this is the most diverse place anywhere
on the planet.
And I hate to use case studies, but you know, when we locally do something that's a model, like monitor and regulate stuff, we actually can export that to other places around the world, and no better place than the United States as far as being incredibly diverse.
Can technology save us from ourselves?
No, but it can be used to monitor situations and educate, and I think that would be probably.
I would argue it
Contraceptives
could.
can.
Not good enough,
Yeah.
though, is it?
Contraceptives can.
Contraceptives are a technology,
Yeah.
and interestingly, a huge amount of a big chunk could be taken out of the population problem by just giving every woman on the planet the equipment and education necessary to control her own reproduction.
And one of the things you'd have to do, of course, is make sure that the man in her life can't tell her not to use them, which I think
Absolutely.
is something, when we were talking about some of these countries with women who are kept in purdah and so on, is that it's not just what they wear, it's the fact that they're so dominated that they cannot participate in birth control.
One of the
extent
things that's
needed.
impeded the international negotiations on climate change is that poor countries, and some rich countries like the United States, aren't willing to enter into agreements. And poor countries make the argument that, look, you rich people got to develop, now it's our turn. And I've argued that we should actually have what I call the condoms for carbon trade-off program, where they get credit for providing contraception to meet the unmet need of women, and that they can be full partners in a climate treaty, not by cutting back on their fossil fuel use, because they use so little today, but by cutting back on population, by unwanted children being born.
Isn't religion part of this, though, in so many parts of the world?
In the profession I've been involved with, it's cradle to the grave. It's everything. It's girls' education, it's infant mortality, it's women's status in society, it's the way economic structures are developed, it's cultural conditioning that starts at birth, it's the way older people are treated in the society. There's nothing that we work with that isn't connected to everything that's involved with the way in which the geography, the history, the culture, the economics, the politics, it's everything. Okay? And what happens is that there's certainly key elements in all of that. First is that you want the pregnancy, you want the birth wanted. And you can't do that, for example, unless you have a woman having the choice to do that. And that means, for one thing, abortion. It means if a person wants to avoid a pregnancy and they're like 28 years old and they already have 3 children, you don't expect them to use condoms for the rest of their life. They need to have access to vasectomies, and women need to have access to methods of permanent contraception. And these are all very complex and difficult situations, particularly in sub-Saharan Africa, where you have no infrastructure of health services. And what's interesting about Africa today is that to the systems that are really affecting and improving the quality of life for people are the marketing systems, because you have more retail stores out there than you have health providers. So the marketing systems are now outperforming the governments in delivering health services.
You mean
They're-
marketing systems, you mean businesses?
The marketing systems are outperforming the way in which we usually establish programs, which were through the government operations, the government trained health providers.
So aren't you then ironically working with a system that is encouraging consumption to hold back conception?
It has nothing to, well, unless you call putting out mosquito nets to prevent malaria consumption. No. It's only related to the contraceptives, the health supplies that actually save women and children's lives and ultimately provide access to the contraceptive means by which they prevent unwanted pregnancies. And there's a long history behind this. But the more important issue that I think that we're all forgetting is that we are not allowing to model our own economy on what Europe has been doing from the day they started using fossil fuels, and that's to tax the systems of consumption so that you can decrease use of energy and improve the efficiency of the way in which transportation takes place. If we had a $10 tax on every gallon of gasoline, our society would change radically overnight. And we're not paying the taxes that is necessary. We have, in the United States, 1% of the population earning 26% of all the income. Right. Well, all you have to do is just tax it.
So what is the
just
reason?
Try it.
All
you have to do is
this is so good because we have the so-called luxury taxes. And finally the light comes on and somebody makes the relationship between nicotine and tobacco and cancer stick. And so we have a new tax and so on. We need these luxury taxes for meat, for dairy,
Absolutely.
we need it for all
Absolutely.
these things. And instead what we have, of course, is we have child subsidy versus in Europe.
The idiots have convinced people that taxes are a burden given to you by the government that have no purpose. In other words, they do not think of buying services from the government, providing services you can't provide yourself.
And being a good guide of where you should spend your money.
That's right. And we're about to see, I would predict fairly soon, an increase in that basically by passing even more money through or keeping it passed through to the richest people in the country who don't spend it, who are not going to, of course, do anything
and don't
good
even
for the
ask
economy.
for it.
Yeah,
the Bush tax cut. The rich people, $500 billion given to rich people by poor people.
Okay, we're kind of drifting off here.
This has a lot to do with the environment because it's not just the inequality within our society. It has a lot to do with if we started taxing the way in which we are consuming in the wrong direction, then we could ultimately create an environment whereby we can protect biodiversity.
What I've heard, hold one second. What I've heard is that we have a two-pronged fork here that's really driving the discussion, and that is overconsumption and overpopulation, conception, consumption. Do we have some kind of consensus that this is really the core of the state of the earth today?
The core is huge. If you look at these other countries like Iran or Pakistan, you see people have, or used to be Mexico, was some rice, a lot of rice, the main part of the diet, and then some beans or a few vegetables. Meat was a luxury good. And now everybody wants more and more of the luxury. And the luxury is, so it was the demand, it was greed that got us there.
But it was advertised and it was generated.
We were catered to.
But Frances,
and the way it was possible was because of the concentration of power within the agricultural system. That was built to sell this destructive system to us.
Frances, I wonder if you could clarify, at least for me, one thing. You seem to be suggesting, but I know you don't mean this, that if people only had more power, that they would do the right thing and our environmental problems would be solved. Surely it takes much more than
The problem is that a lot of people don't get the information because it's not in the best interest of those in power to give the information. So how do we combat that?
And we live in a country in which there are more than 24 lobbyists for every person that you and I have elected to represent us in Washington. And it's that we can see where public financing of elections, such as in Maine, have made a huge difference in the environment. Maine has passed absolutely groundbreaking environmental legislation because 80% of the legislators in Maine have run without corporate money. So
is that mandated, or is that voluntary?
it was passed.
Oh, I see.
It's a voluntary system. You have to, but 80% have volunteered to run without public money. And it means, I mean, excuse me, without private money, without corporate money. So a waitress, one of my heroes in the world, a small town waitress with a high school education, was able to win and be reelected, and now is a leader on the environmental committee for the state of Maine. So that's my vision then of this living democracy with money out, ourselves in, but not just to point the fingers, but to step up and be part of the solution ourselves.
Part of the solution also is changing the educational system
Absolutely.
very rapidly, because we're in deep trouble. If you ask the average American where their food comes from, they'll tell you the supermarket.
Yeah.
Oh, yes.
And
we used to have an animal sanctuary, and the kids would come in. We'd send a bus into inner city, bring them out, and they were stunned. They had no idea that the food on their plate was related to these wonderful, vibrant, whole animals who had personalities and things that they were busy doing.
Yeah.
So yes, education, but of course that, again, is suppressed by the happy piggies in the dancing, along with the aprons in the food commercials. So I think parents have an enormous responsibility to not have their children grow up with the same mythology about food that we grew up with, perhaps, and to turn them in the right direction for their health, for the environment, and for the animals.
We're getting a lot of good solutions here, and I'm reminded of John Cobb talking about oikos, a Greek word meaning household. And he said very eloquently, you know, economics and ecology are from the same root word. Ecology is the management of the biological side of the household. Economics is the management of the business side of the household, and we have to have that marriage. We haven't talked too much about economics. We've touched on it a little bit, but I think if we're going to ultimately talk about solving any ecological crisis, we're going to have to talk about the economics of it as well. One of the things that has impressed me with this conversation today, and I'll go back to the great-grandchild. I have 3 grandchildren, but Paul has a great-grandchild. We're talking about intergenerational equity. And we don't hear that term very much, and we haven't talked much about justice and the marginalized. Global warming, climate change, food choices is going to affect the marginalized and poor first. But I like the fact that we have all emphasized the importance of doing this for tomorrow, because, you know, as the old Hebrew idea of planting a tree, and the rabbi said, well, you're not going to see that tree grow to fruition, and the person who planted said, yes, but my grandchildren will. And that's the importance, I think, of the message we've been communicating here today, because each one of us are making some changes, and maybe after the passionate cries for giving up meat, more of us in our listening audience will understand the importance of that. But if we can all...
Free vegetarian starter kit for anyone who does.
I'm sure.
It's a bottle of wine.
That's
yes,
for
the
dinner
fruit
tonight.
group.